ACNFers, you know deep down that I love a good beer, or several, and at times, a tasty non-alcoholic beer scratches that itch when I'm trying not to be hungover AF. If you visit athleticbrewing.com and use the promo code BrendanO20 at checkout, you get a nice little discount on your first order. Free Wave and Athletic Light are my favorites. Tell them I sent you. I don't get any money, and they are not a sponsor of the show. I am just an ambassador, and I love celebrating this frothy, hoppy product.
Saying like I'm a very like hands-on, get my hands dirty, learn as much as I can, absorb as much as I can in the editing process, because I really want to know a story inside and out.
Well, yeah, no, and I thought I was the only one who did that. I'll be like, oh, I thought of this, like, of course everyone else is writing about like Tunisia's butt plugs in the 1915s. And I'll tell my boyfriend and he'll be like, Hallie, you really think so? And I'm like, oh, I'm too in my bubble that I think that.
Well, hey, CNFers is the creative nonfiction podcast, the show where I speak to primarily badass writers about the art of telling true stories. I'm Brendan O'Mara, that guy you don't want to sit next to on the bus. Hallie Lieberman is our guest today on this little podcast that could. She's this month's featured Atavistian writer, so spoiler alerts. You could very well go to magazine.atavist.com and read her story on the Handcuff Man, a serial attacker targeting gay men in Atlanta at the height of the AIDS epidemic in the early 90s. Consider subscribing to the Atavist. I don't get any kickbacks. No ads. Blockbuster stories once a month. Honestly, the no ads part is kind of like the biggest selling point for me. You can read and immerse yourself in the work without a fucking perfume ad taking up half your screen and all your RAM gets taken up. NewYorker.com. Hallie is a writer, a journalist, a historian who carved out a niche covering the sex industry. She's the author of Buzz, a stimulating history of the sex toy. I want to read it. Maybe I will. Oh, you don't think I will? Now I'm going to do it. Show notes to this episode and more are at BrendanO'Mara.com, where you can sign up for the monthly Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter, a short riff, 4 books, and 7 links. It literally goes up to 11. There's a writing prompt in there. CNF and Happy Hour is back. All you must do is give me your email. First of the month, no spam. Can't beat it. There's also patreon.com/CNFpod if you want to throw a few bucks in the kitty. And you know what I do that is like super cool and you get like a super fucking discount? Depending on your tier, I offer one-on-one office hours. It's stupid, bonkers, good idea. I'm making it more structured, and I'll iron out those details a little more. But if you want more of that, a little one-on-one counsel, you know what? Not going to find a better deal than at patreon.com/CNFpod. First, we're going to hear from Sayward Darby, editor-in-chief of The Atavist and the lead editor of Hallie's piece. She's going to talk about developing an editing style in the same way that we talk about how writers have style and voice. I asked her about like editing style, editing voice, sort of, and some common areas of bloat that she finds in stories that are almost unilaterally better on the cutting room floor. I'll do a parting shot at the end of the show, but let's get things started with Sayward Riff. Never a wasted word, especially in the drafting, because sometimes that you need to lay down that road before you know where potholes are. So yeah, I guess just for in talking about that element of it, that even that throat clearing, as much as it's gonna get clipped out, it sometimes has to get down anyway to get you over that hump and to get you started.
I totally agree with that. Like no word is like a wasted word if you're putting it down. And similarly, I had a professor in college, my thesis advisor actually, who reminded me that like thinking is a part of the writing process. And so he's like, don't beat yourself up if you're not putting words down, because you are thinking and considering, and just because there are words on the page doesn't necessarily mean that's any better than the things you're thinking in your head. I mean, take that with a grain of salt. Maybe some people disagree with that, but yeah, I think I definitely work out ideas both as an editor and a writer, and I always tell writers too, I'd rather have more than less to work with. Which is not to say like please don't file 100,000 word story, that's insane. Also please don't file a 40,000 word story. But like when people say, oh, I was thinking the word count was going to be around 8,000, I think I might send it at more like 10 to 12, I'm sorry. And I mean 99% of the time that's completely fine, because actually having more gives more options, also gives me a better sense of kind of what you're thinking is important, what you're trying to say in the piece, that kind of stuff. I mean, cutting can be hard and killing your darlings can be hard. But I think that there really is something to be said for just writing everything you feel like you need to write.
Across the pieces you edit, are there common bloat that you see in stories like, oh, this is just what people tend to overwrite, and like this can almost unilaterally always go?
But sometimes people feel the need to like overplay transitions between like ideas or sections, almost essentially like summarizing what you just said or summarizing where you're about to go. It can often just feel like this isn't necessary, like just keep telling us the story. I would say sometimes people get description of stuff, so places, people, and just because they have it they want to put it in because it's color. If you take a step back and say, but does this really serve the story, does it serve the purpose of the story, sometimes it just doesn't. And just because you have it doesn't mean you need to use it. And I think that especially this is tough when writers are working on stories that are not inherently quote colorful.
Mm-hmm.
So or situations where they can't see the action, or we're not able to witness the action. They are often like, well, I'll just go at length describing like the building that this took place in or something. And it's like, well, but does the building itself mean anything to the story? Like, did somebody get lost in the corridors of the building?
Yeah.
Or, I don't know, like, do the windows play some role in it's like, what are we doing with that description? And sort of the same thing with people's physicality, like telling me the color, hair, and height and rough frame of a person is not, I mean, sometimes it's totally fine and great, like, thank you, now I can see them better. But other times it can start to feel pretty perfunctory. And so those are ones that jump to mind. But it really depends on the story. There are stories where I wind up cutting a lot of history because it's like, well, that's super interesting, but we're not writing a book.
Mm-hmm.
And we want to kind of cherry pick what history is most relevant or representative, to contextualize a story we're telling. But then there are other stories where there's really not a lot of history, and it's just you just have a ton of reporting right in front of you, and you're trying to figure out well, what's the most important stuff here. I find myself as an editor just cutting the stuff that doesn't pop as much, that doesn't speak to the themes and the narrative as much.
For sure. And with writers, we talk about style and voice a lot, and I wanted to get a sense of maybe editing as style, or style in editing, and maybe how you arrived at your particular voice as an editor.
I mean, I was thinking about this. So I was at the Power of Narrative conference last weekend, and I was telling my husband how hard it is to talk about editing and to explain like how you edit.
Mm-hmm.
Which, I mean, I think the same certainly goes for writing in a lot of ways. But for me, especially at the Atavist now, for these last 7 years, we're such a small shop, and it's really just me and Jonah half time. And it's been a pretty like solitary process. And so my collaboration is with the writers, but not necessarily with other editors, with the exception of Jonah, of course. A lot of how and because I think I'm continually developing, we're all developing, growing, changing, improving at what we do, hopefully. So it's kind of hard to say like, I learned a lesson here, or, this person gave me great advice, or something along those lines. I think that, stylistically, I'm aware that I'm a tough editor insofar as I always think something can be better. And again, with Atavist stories, I know that readers really expect a super high level of quality, thought, structure, because they know that we're only publishing once a month. If you're, I don't know, a restaurant that makes one thing, you better make it really, really well every single time. And so I think, partially my approach to editing has been influenced by, just the nature of the Atavist. And so, I definitely jump into things and I'm immediately like, looking for ways to really like make something the best version of itself, and as opposed to, this is what is in front of me, how do I kind of fix it around the edges, improve it around the edges. Like I'm way more prone to saying, well, have we thought about kind of blowing it up and taking the pieces apart and putting it back together? And to be clear, like in previous lives, I edited very differently, because I was moving more quickly, and it was just completely different types of publications. I mean, I'm definitely also an editor who I do research as I go. So I think this comes from being a fact checker, early in my career, and then certainly also being a reporter writer myself. If I'm reading something and and I'm like, oh, I have a question about that, I'm more likely to go learn about it myself than just put into a comment bubble, tell me more about this. Which, but I also like to think that that actually makes me a better editor of the project in the long run, because then I'm kind of like developing my own knowledge base as I go, as opposed to just saying like, okay, I have this in front of me, I'm trying to kind of figure out the structure, kind of trying to figure out the voice, whatever it may be. I'm also really trying to get a lot of knowledge under my belt about the topic so that I can make informed suggestion. I also hope that by kind of learning that stuff myself, I'm also not asking as many like obvious questions to writers. And so, if I go and read a court filing or skim a court filing related to a story that we're working on, then I just have it in my head and am able to say, oh, okay, like, these were the dynamics in play. These were the witnesses who spoke. Like, okay, I can see this scene better. And now I have a better handle on it. So I don't think that there's a right or a wrong way to do these things. That's just kind of the thing that works well for me, and I think that works well for the Atavist. So yeah, I guess that's a long way of saying like I'm a very like hands-on, get my hands dirty, learn as much as I can, absorb as much as I can in the editing process, because I really want to know a story inside and out.
And regarding Hallie's piece on the Handcuff Man, what when this comes across your desk, what's your first impressions of it, and then what were some unique challenges for you on the editor's side to bring this piece to light?
Yeah, well, so I had worked with Hallie before. She wrote a story for us in 2018 called The Trigger Effect, which is a fantastic story that I highly recommend people go read. It was a finalist for the DART Award for the coverage of trauma. And it's about a shooting, a campus shooting that happened at Georgia Tech. And it's about the year after the shooting, essentially what happened and the effect that it had on the victims' friends, on campus culture. And it's just a really, really great piece. So Hallie and I had worked super closely together on that, and I really enjoyed working with her. She is based in Georgia. She has a really deep well of knowledge, particularly about issues pertaining to LGBT communities and sex work. And I should say the Trigger Effect, that story involves a student who was queer. The victim was queer. So when Hallie pitched, I was like, great, love Hallie. She's a delight, and somebody who I think brings a lot of expertise and thoughtfulness to her work on some pretty, what can be some pretty delicate stories. And what's interesting in the case of the Handcuff Man story, I'd never heard of this case, and the way I'm kind of thinking about it as like the Jeffrey Dahmer of Atlanta, basically. This serial predator that you've probably never heard of unless you were, a gay man in Atlanta in the 1980s. And it was one of those moments where I was like, no, there's absolutely nobody in the world better positioned than Hallie to write about this. She had already secured great sources, including some former sex workers. And again, she's the kind of person who I just know really like has respect for those people, is used to talking to them about, their work, about their personal lives, their histories. And so I immediately kind of felt comfortable with her, like where she was positioned vis-a-vis her sources. And then it was also one of these historical stories where there was just a lot of like a wealth of archival material that was, I mean, quite honestly, really fun to go through. Old newspaper articles, like Susan Faludi, like like covered or mentioned the Handcuff Man in a story of hers, like, I don't know, about a decade before she won the Pulitzer. And so that was also like exciting to me, was realizing that there was this, not only were there really good human sources she was going to have access to, but there was this rich archive. It's a story that also, is very much of a time, of a place. And I think that, the gay community, the gay scene in Atlanta is kind of its own character in the story. We're talking about a time period in which, on the one hand, the community was more robust than it had ever been, more out, quote unquote, than it had ever been. But sodomy was still illegal in Georgia, and the HIV/AIDS crisis was, obviously, I think, pretty close to its peak if we're talking pure numbers. And so, this very tense time, very dramatic time. And I really liked the way she was thinking about place in that regard. And then the other thing is, like, there was just such an incredible amount of detail about the perpetrator, who he was, what his backstory was, and, how he was able to get away with what he did for so long. And so on the one hand, he's a bit of a cipher in the story. On the other hand, I think you actually get closer to him than is often the case in stories like this. So that's all to say, like, when the pitch came through, it had a lot of components that immediately made me think, oh, this is going to work well for us. And to kind of tie things together with what we were talking about a moment ago, when Hallie first filed her piece, I want to say it wound up being, it's on the shorter side for us, which is of course still long. It's like 8,000-ish words. And she filed, like, I want to say like twice that length. A lot of what wound up getting cut was history and context. And Hallie is a historian, and it makes a ton of sense that, she would be able to deliver a lot of material that contextualizes what was going on, the time, the place, the people. And it was all, to be clear, absolutely fascinating. So I was reading it through and I was like, yep, absolutely, would read a book about this, But then for the purposes of the story, it was like, okay, what of those details feels really essential to the story we're trying to tell here? I hope that all that stuff that hit the cutting room floor ultimately is useful for her at some point. Maybe there is a book somewhere in here, I don't know, not necessarily about the Handcuff Man specifically, but, about queer life in the Deep South, or gay life in the Deep South, at this time. So it's such a dark story on the one hand, but it was also, I think, a story that, I'm always jazzed to work on our stories, but I was definitely jazzed to work on this one because of like all those things I just described, like just knowing that all of those components were there.
How hard is that conversation to have with a writer when ultimately you're going to be cutting 50% of what they submit?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I usually don't tell them that. I don't usually say, "Hey, I'm gonna dive into the edit, and I'm probably gonna cut like half of it," because I feel like it's one of those things you have to see it, right? Like, if you say that, that sounds terrifying. If you say that, it sounds like, oh my God, you're gonna, mangle my story. And so more often what I do is I just do it and then send, when I send my edit, like I try to explain as best, I can, that the number of words cut is in no way a reflection of the quality of the story, like at all. Those things don't really have anything to do with each other as far as I'm concerned. It just means that in reading this story, I felt like the version of it that we had discussed. And to be clear, like I've always had conversations with writers before they turn something in, so there's no like surprise I'm actually going to make it into something else. It's more like we've talked about this, we had these goals in mind, and I think to reach those goals, I think this shorter length is better. I also always tell people, or I try to always tell people, if I haven't, that's only because I forgot, which is, if you disagree, if there are things that are no longer in here that you think are essential that you want to talk about, like this is a collaborative process. Tell me that. Like, tell me if there are things you feel like need to go back in. And like, I'm very, very open to that. So I also similarly, like, I almost never send track changed first edits, because I always have them. Like I have the track change version saved, but then I usually just clean it up and send it to people, because I think seeing all that red or blue or green or whatever it is, like terrifies people. And it's like, oh no, look at everything that's wrong. And it's like, or don't look at all of that and just look at what's in front of you. Like, the piece of clay that's now been kind of shaped into something. And do you like it better? And if you don't, like, we'll figure it out. But I think that like there are these triggers people have about, quantity of words, color of things on screen that can almost distract them from the real question, which is this working better? So that's how I approach it, for better or for worse.
Yeah, when you make cuts of that nature and you send, that new document, oftentimes you don't even know it's gone. You know what I mean? Like you're reading it and you're like, if there's like a phantom limb kind of scene, like, okay, maybe that's a good jumping off point for a conversation about putting something back in. But by and large, like if you just read along going, oh, this sounds all right, be like, I didn't even realize that this character that I spent 500 words on, it doesn't contribute anything. It's just taking up too much stage time. I don't even know it's gone.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it, is like, if you can just say, hey, shift your perspective, like try not to compare it too much to what you turned in. Try to keep in mind what we, talked about, because, a first draft is like aiming at a target, and, maybe you're not quite at the bullseye, but we've talked about the bullseye. Right. And so like, can you try to kind of focus on that and see if this new thing in front of you, which is a proposal, works for you? And I think your phantom limb description is exactly right. If somebody says, man, I feel really strongly about this, I think it really adds XYZ to the piece, or, I just think like it's such a cool piece of reporting. Like, I want to make sure, all that kind of stuff. Like we'll figure it out. Like, I can't really think of a situation where if somebody said, I feel strongly about this, I would say no. Maybe, okay, we find a way to tighten it, or, tuck it in somewhere. Read it through, and do you really miss what's not there? Ask yourself that. And if you do miss it, why do you miss it? Do you miss it because you were proud of it? Do you miss it because you feel like the story now has lost something? Do you miss it because the story now doesn't make sense to you in the same way? Like there, and sort of like working through through your feelings, Brendan. That's what I'm talking about.
Or it took you a year to find a document or something,
right.
and yes. It's like to find a source. You're like, oh God, and now we're gonna cut it. This took me forever to find.
Absolutely. And look, I get it. And like, I want to talk about that stuff with writers, and I want to give them my 2 cents to say, okay, as an editor, therefore as a reader, I'm telling you, like, this is why I found it inessential or unessential, or, I don't know, confusing, or, took us down a sort of side path we didn't need to go down. I can absolutely be convinced to keep it in if you can explain why. And oftentimes in that explanation, the why and the where of it will become apparent, right? Because sometimes in saying, well, I think this, it's like, oh, well, that's okay. I see what you're saying. Like, well, then that means we should probably tuck it into section 3, not section 6. You know what I mean? Like, that conversation can often be generative in its own way.
Awesome. Well, as always say, we're this side of the table is always so illuminating to what's forthcoming with Hallie's piece, and then Hallie's participation in this conversation. So as always, thanks so much for the time, and we're going to kick it over to Hallie in just a moment.
Thanks so much.
All right, you all warmed up? You ready for the real workout? Hallie was a trip, man. There's mention of Tunisian butt plugs. Okay. Hallie has a PhD from the University of Wisconsin with a dissertation in sex toy history. Her work has appeared in Bitch, Bust, Eater, and The Atavist. She had a story run in 2018 titled Trigger Effect. Visit HallieLieberman.com to learn more about her and follow her on social media at Hallie Lieberman. There's 2 L's in Hallie. She lives in Atlanta, and she was a true pleasure to hang out with. She talks about rejection, sticking it to her dissertation committee, and how to maybe find wills. Here's Hallie.
Yeah, so basically I got into this story because I was working on male sex workers but with female clients, and then I got asked to give this like keynote speech at an academic conference, but it was like a pre-conference. It wasn't that big a deal. But anyway, they said, can you do something on the sexual history of the South? And I decided to start in Atlanta, like where the conference was, where I live. And I literally went into newspapers.com and searched male prostitute and Atlanta Journal-Constitution and found the story. And that's how it all began.
That was kind of a big jumping off point. I wanted to kind of as in a global sense about how you find story ideas. For you, is it as simple as putting in a search of that nature into newspapers.com, or do you have other little reservoirs that you're in your like storing things?
That makes me sound so basic, which in a way is true. I have basically like a laser focus on certain subjects and look for the stories everywhere. So, but no, where else I find stories? I find so many stories on Reddit. So many. And I search certain subreddits like sex work, subreddit, sex toys, gossip subreddits, all this stuff for stories as well. I follow sex industry news, follow some Facebook groups. That's all a part of it.
When do you feel, or like what's kind of the spidey sense that you feel when you find something, you're like, oh, that one in particular feels like it could be rich?
So there are a couple things. One of the things is if I talk to someone who, like a friend who, could either be polite with a story and be like, oh, okay, that sounds interesting, or it's like, wait, what happens next? Wait, tell me the end of the story. So I gauge like friends, boyfriend, parents, all like anybody you're talking to, if they have that kind of interest, you kind of know, okay, you got something there. And that happened with the Handcuff Man, where it was like, I have to be honest here, two of my friends, teenagers, and including a 7-year-old who should not have been overhearing the conversation about the Handcuff Man, and that's my fault, and I feel guilty. But anyway, they were asking questions like, oh wait, tell me more about this. So that's how I knew this story was good.
And then it's a matter of it seems like, okay, this feels juicy, and then you gotta find the material too to kind of like back it up. And at what point did you know, especially with Handcuff Man, that it was like, oh, there's a lot here to work with and shape?
Well, okay, so basically I had to give this speech at the conference, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna do the Handcuff Man. This is fun. This can be like in 45-minute talk. There was so much that I had to leave out of this talk. There was, I had all the newspaper articles from newspapers.com, but then there were all these victims that I was like, oh, I could reach out to them. There were the court documents. I found out Handcuff Man was a suspect in the Atlanta child murders from the 1980s, which were these huge things where there were Atlanta missing and murdered children. A bunch of children just disappeared in the city. And for months, they were trying to figure out who was doing this. It was terrifying. So yeah, there was just so much material. And after I gave the talk, people were like, is this going to be a podcast? Where can we hear more about that? Well, what happens? And I was like, oh my God, I need to write this thing out.
And when you were looking to pitch it and formulate a query of some kind that obviously ends up landing with the Atavist. What did that look like, and what were the nuts and bolts of this particular pitch?
It was threading the needle, right? Because this is true crime, and true crime draws eyeballs. I like true crime. I'm not a true crime head like some of my friends are, but I'm into it. But I had to, like, in the pitch, I didn't want to just be like, crime. Um, yeah, which is, has its place, and I like it, but I like it more as a Trojan horse into a bigger story. For me, that bigger story is the story of sex work and the history of sex work and the history of gay men and how we have treated gay sexuality, paid sexuality, all this stuff. The fact that we, have criminalized gay men. Gay men were criminalized at the time the Handcuff Man was coming and finding them, kidnapping them, setting their genitals on fire. Gay sex was criminalized, and also sex work was criminalized. And so for me, it was like, this is a Trojan horse into this world that it's hard to get people to pay attention to because it's super depressing. It's the AIDS era. And yes, people want to know this history, but they're not really going to make a choice, I don't think, to read and learn about it that much because it's so depressing. But with the true crime angle, with this, you Trojan horse it and you learn about this era and how, making everything illegal, making being gay illegal, making sex work illegal allows predators like the Handcuff Man to thrive. And for me, it was like, put that in the pitch, show that yes, it's true crime, yes, it'll attract people, but the bigger story, it has this bigger kernel that's so important about the history of queer people and the history of sex work. And that is what I'm trying to show through this story in part. So that was what I tried to do in the pitch. And Atavist fortunately lets you do like super long pitches because the stories are super long. And so I was able to get all that in there. I also put like, hey, I have sources of victims. Hey, I'm doing archival research at Georgia State University. I live here. I have neighbors who were here at the time. So I put all that in there.
Excellent. That was what I wanted to unpack a little bit too, and it's where a lot of people go wrong in pitches. It's you might have the kernel of what could be a good story, but you haven't proven that you necessarily have access or the documents or a library card where you can really plumb the depths of whatever subculture you're going down, what rabbit hole you're going down. So it's really, I think, good for people to hear, to be like, okay, that's the kind of stuff you really need to prove in the pitch if you're going to get commissioned to write a story of this nature.
Saying that, people are listening, they're like, oh, I'm never going to have the sources. Like, you have more sources than you think you do. Like, literally my sources, I mean, they didn't really make it into the story, but they were useful for just general ideas about it, were like literally my neighbors. So even if you think you don't have the sources, like, there are special collections in almost every city. There are local, like, if you're doing a story and you want to do a historical story, like, you can get the sources, just like walk into, like, most archives are public, you just need to make an appointment. You can walk in there, talk to an archivist, talk to a research librarian. There are resources there. I think it does seem like there are, barriers to entry, because I was talking to my friend about my research and she's like, I want to go to archives, but I don't know how to. I'm like, no, you can go in them. So I think putting yourself out there a little more, you have more resources, more people can do this kind of work, I think, than think they can.
Yeah, can you, in your career as a journalist and reporter and a writer, can you point to kind of like an early win that you experienced that really put fuel in your tank to, just to keep you on this path?
Yeah, so I will say, like, after getting my PhD in 2014, I couldn't get anything published, to the point I couldn't get an academic article published. I tried to write for the Impulsive Buy, a junk food blog I read that's literally, like, I love it. It's pictures of finds in Walmart and other things like that, like the newest kind of Oreos. And I tried to write for them and I got rejected. They said, your voice isn't a fit for us. it was like horrible. And I was so depressed. So I was completely depressed and couldn't get my stuff published anywhere. And I think like a lot of times this part of the story is left out. I like literally walked into the lake and like in Wisconsin, and was like, this was after like 5 years of trying, 4.5 years of trying to get this academic article in the history of the vibrator published. I did every change the editor said, and then it got rejected. So I was at this completely low point, and the win that made me, I was like suicidal, depressed, on the maximum dose of Zoloft, which I exceeded the maximum dose now. I'm very proud. I'm on 250 milligrams. um, but yeah, and I was like, no one loves me. No one. My boyfriend was like, I love you. I'm like, shut the fuck up. And so I was insufferable. But I really felt like a failure. I was like, I can't go on living. I'm a writer. And then I pitched a story to, well, first off, I agreed to write for free for a local queer magazine. That gave me a little self-confidence. And after doing that, and I hadn't written the story yet, my boyfriend's like, look, because I'd pitched this story on Gosnell Duncan, the inventor of the silicone dildo, to Atlantic. They were interested. They ultimately declined. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm horrible. And Eric's like, why don't you pitch it to Bitch Magazine? I just Googled publications, see if they're interested. Pitched the same story. I actually got a phone call from my editor. It was the first yes I had gotten in basically my whole life. And aside from writing for the student newspaper in undergrad, and it changed my life. It led for me to get an agent, because I put in there I was working on a book. I got an email from an agent in New York. And now this story became an audiobook. It really, and I, wrote a book. It changed my life. But those low points, like, you think, I'm sure a lot of your listeners have been there. It's horrible, but you can get out of them. But yeah, I know that feeling. It's just awful. And that was the turning point for me.
What kept you going and persevering in the face of just that monumental rejection?
So what kept me going, even though I hate to admit it, my boyfriend's like at work, is like my boyfriend being like, I love you, like you're wonderful. And my friends, my friend Allison, who she died of cancer actually at age 36 in 2021. But she was like right before she died, and I feel so guilty doing this, but I said, like, do you think I can be a full-time writer? And she said, of course. And anyway, so I had these friends and family who were really, that kept me going. But no matter, like, I literally would not leave my bed, like I was that depressed. But then there's this little hint of me in the back of my head where it's like, I can do this. I need to do this. This is like, I have no skills. I can work at Chili's, that was in the back of my head. Chili's said they would always welcome me back. It was a Chili's in Colorado Springs. So I was like, okay, I could always work at Chili's. But there was just a little part of me that was like, you can, you need to do this. You can do this. You can't give up. And that's what kept me going. I would literally get out of bed, pitch something, and crawl back into bed. And that's like where I was. And sometimes I feel like a weirdo. I'm like, am I the only one who did this? But I doubt I am. But anyway, that's what kept me going. I wanted to tell these stories. I thought they were important. I'm obsessed with the history of sex. I'm obsessed with telling stories that no one else gives a shit about. So that's what kept me going.
Well, that's amazing. And it also, it just, in terms of your why, like why you pursue writing in a career like this. And, I constantly question that myself. Like, why do we like put ourselves through the mill of doing this to try to get, work published and try to platform people that might be under-platformed or what? And I wonder what your why is, because that's ultimately kind of what keeps us going on this, because it defies all logic in a lot of ways.
Yeah. So for my thing is like, if I don't tell, this makes me think like there are other good writers who could possibly tell the stories I'm telling. So of course, but my thing is these stories weren't being told. Like there's this history. So for the Handcuff Man in particular, there's this history that is literally in my neighborhood. I have neighbors who are in their 70s who were alive during this time who didn't know this story. And when I told them, their eyes lit up, and most of my neighbors are gay men. It's amazing. Love my neighborhood. And they were like, oh, wait a second. I'm going to ask my friends about the Handcuff Man. Oh, how do I not know this queer history? Like, and I'm like, okay, so if I have people who are around who didn't know it, it's like it's an important part of the history that needs to be told. And if I don't do it, I'm not sure anyone else will do it. Sex workers in general, their stories are forgotten. Like, we have so few archives that even, and I'm writing a story about this right now for the Boston Globe about sex in the archives and porn in the archives, but there's so few archives that will even accept sexual material. So and the ones that do, like Kinsey Institute in Indiana, just got defunded. So these stories literally are not making into the archives in a lot of places. And if they are, like at Georgia State, where is some sex in the archives, they have to hide it from the Republican legislature if it's any public university. So you have multiple places where these stories are getting hidden, erased, not saved, and there's like the cliche, okay, if I'm gonna if I get really sick and I'm gonna die, burn all my porn, clear all my history. We have this like shame, so a lot of the stuff doesn't get saved because there's shame surrounding it. And so that's what like drives me. I'm like, I have no shame. I ran around yelling about penises when I was like 5 years old. My dad because he's Jewish, thought I was going to be a urologist. Hoped I was going to be a urologist. and I was like, no, like I'm not smart enough to be a urologist. So I became the second best thing, not really like the millionth best thing, which is a writer, a sex historian. But yeah, so if you're lucky enough to have a subject you're passionate about and you don't have shame and you can tell these stories that are hidden, then that's what will drive you.
Well, since a lot of people are hung up in a shame way around sex and talking about it, writing about it, and how have you over the years, grown comfortable with writing about it? Like you said, you're shameless, but I have to think that it goes deeper than that. That you're able to, because you are trying to preserve something that gets purged in when you want to clear your browser history or something. Like you're trying to preserve something.
Yeah, and so one of the things that I will answer this is that I forgot to say was Magnus Hirschfeld, like one of the best archives of the history of sex and history of trans people, literally got burned down by the Nazis and destroyed by the Nazis. So there's a big history of these archives not just being destroyed by individuals, but by fascists. So you're talking about me. Yes, it's not just that I'm naturally shameless. I have had challenges. So when I first wanted to write about the history of sex, or wanted to write about sex in grad school, my PhD program, my advisor told me not to. He said, don't write about this, wait until you get tenure, don't write about the history of sex toys.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I was like, well, no one's getting tenure anymore. That's not going to happen. I don't care. I'm going to do it anyway. And I chose an advisor who I thought I could boss around, because apparently we choose advisors like are a parental figure, and my parents have been like afraid of me. So I had selected someone I thought I could boss around, and I did. He said, oh, okay, Hallie, like do it. But there were challenges, like even at my committee, like when I was getting my PhD and defending it, there was one woman on my committee actually, and she was the one who said, are sex toys worth studying? And she said this to me, is the history worth studying? She said it sincerely, and it was like a dagger to my heart. And I said, and I thought, well, they might not pass me, I might not get my PhD, but fuck it. I don't care. I'm going to defend this thing because you just said that to me in the shittiest way. I said, look, your colleague studied literally the history of pencils. Okay. There's someone wrote a whole book, Henry Petrosky, on the history of that. I consider that valid. But why is that not questioned, but sex toys are? What's the difference? And the difference is it's about sex and people think that's not valid. Well, that's exactly why I'm going to study it. So yes, I had challenges, in fact, throughout trying to challenge the current history of the vibrator that was out there. That was the paper that didn't get published, with Technology and Culture, which was this journal, because another scholar had published in there. I was challenging her. They said, you're not feminist enough. So yes, there have been challenges throughout the way. But I mean, in the face of that, you just go, well, this is something I think it's important. The more challenges, as my dad told me, like if it was easy, everyone would do it. Anything worth doing is not going to be easy. My parents tell me, I agree. And so you just have to keep that stuff in the back of your head.
Yeah, that's it's a really good thing to say, because I remember an earlier conversation I had with Susan Orlean about she was just talking about her, like, I think even just reporting on the Orchid Thief, and like okay, but listen though, I just kind of fumbled and bumbled and tumbled all over myself in trying to relay this particular anecdote to Hallie. And I was like, you know what? Why don't I go try and find the tape of exactly what I was talking about regarding Susan and pull out that clip? And I did, and I found it, and it's going to go right here, right now.
But anybody could go look up the history of South Florida. And my editor said to me, but they won't. By which he meant, you're learning this for your reader. And it doesn't matter whether you learned it by having a first-person experience or you learned it by going to the library and doing research.
Yeah, it's inspiring hearing someone that like accomplished being like, oh, someone else would have done it. Yeah. Because sometimes I feel exactly that same way. Like, oh, well, someone just could have just reported this out. Why didn't they? Like, oh, well, I guess I'll just, like her editor's right. Like, there are definitely stories that other people are not going to tell or not going to tell in the way you're going to tell them.
Yeah. And I think, too, like sometimes I get into this habit of like, oh, if I think of an idea or something, like, oh, like, if I thought of it, then shit, it must have already been done. Like I like kind of like don't value my own input and my own ideas. I'm like, well, if I thought about it, someone else must have already done this, so I'm not going to do it. And so it's a way of undercutting yourself. And like fact is like sometimes your ideas are worth pursuing, and no one else is going to run with it because you're following your particular taste.
Well, yeah, no, and I thought I was the only one who did that. I'll be like, oh, I thought of this, like, of course, everyone else is writing about like Tunisia's butt plugs in the 1915s. And I'll tell my boyfriend, and he'll be like, Hallie, you really think so? And I'm like, oh, I'm too in my bubble that I think that. So yeah, like, sometimes it's nice to have a reality check, or my friends being like, yeah, no, yeah, I'm not writing about that. But yeah, it is easy to fall into that trap. And I do the same thing. Like if I get published in, a good outlet, I'm like, well, if I got published there, it's not that good. And so kind of the sheen like goes off of it. Yeah. Like, and I'm like, wait a second, that's like crazy.
I know. When I got into my MFA program, like mid-aughts, I remember thinking like the first thing I thought of was just like, oh wow, this must have been a weak admittance class to if they accepted me, man, they must have been desperate.
Yeah. Well, that makes me. And where was your MFA program?
It was low residency at a Townsend, Maryland, so at Goucher College.
Oh, cool.
A creative nonfiction program.
Yeah, no, I definitely have the same vibe. And it's funny. I'm like, I always wondered if I'm a creative nonfiction writer, and I thought I like wasn't good enough to do it. Mm-hmm. And I was like, Eric, but I'm going to be on a creative nonfiction podcast. Does that mean I do creative nonfiction? And he was like, I guess so. I was asking my boyfriend, like, and I didn't know. I thought that was something more creative people did. Like, I'm not creative. So I think we all have these kind of like, no matter how much, it's nice to hear people like Susan, like Orlean, like say that like, no matter how much success people have, they still have this like kind of insecurity. And I think that's maybe a creative person thing or a writer thing or something. Yeah.
Well, and it's been exacerbated by the last 15 years by the algorithms that control us. And we just are constantly bombarded with what we perceive to be everyone's successes. And we're just constantly comparing ourselves to other people and the perception that they're broadcasting versus how crappy we feel for getting like 20 rejections in a month and like no feedback or just silence from, and he's just like, God damn it, I've been doing this for 20 years and I'm still wrestling with all this bullshit. Like, shouldn't it get better?
Yeah, I know. Like, and that's why I feel like I need to talk openly about all my rejections. I've gotten so many rejections. It's ridiculous. And I still get so many rejections a day, or not a day, but like every week when you pitch. And, and it's, but then you see everyone being successful, like the social media stuff, and you're like, motherfucker, like, what's wrong with me? So yeah, so it's like never ending. But for me, all I need is like one yes. If I have one yes going on, if I've got a story going on, then I'm like, okay, it's like the armor to handle like all the no's that are gonna come in. And I think like and I don't know if you feel this way, but like as I go on and I get used to getting lots of no's, and some stories I'll get, like Handcuff Man got rejected from a number of outlets before the Atavist took it. Like it was going to be there was a podcast company really interested in it. There were a couple podcast companies really interested in it. And so I'm glad it's going to be an audio story as well. But like, I started to question, is this even a good story? You start to think, oh, it sucks, man. I suck. I'm a loser.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, yeah, I mean, it's just, I think it's natural, I guess.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's just like, if it gets turned down so many times, you're like, well, there's got to be a reason. And the most likely reason is like, it's not a good enough story. Or if it's a good enough story, I'm just somehow incapable of selling it in a way that internally resonates with me. Like, why can't I convince anyone that this has as much value as I think it has? And that ultimately comes down to, I don't know, maybe it's just like, oh my God, I'm not skilled enough to see the capital A, what this thing is about, to really get it across the goal line. And then you talk yourself in circles, and then you just throw it in a drawer, forget about it altogether.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have like the drawer of dead pitches or whatever, like virtual drawer,
Right.
like on your computer. But yeah, I mean, and I've had enough stuff that like I've gotten 20 rejections and then one yes, and it's got on to be like, it's funny because sometimes you'll have stories like that, and then it comes out, and then you get all this interest from it, and then you get people saying, well, like, were you following a trend on this story? I'm like, following a trend, bitch. Like, everyone told me like it was terrible. Like, like, I'm like, what? Like, people have no clue, and like they mean well, but like they have no clue. Like, when something gets in print, and suddenly people think, all these things, and like they don't see the fight to get there.
Yeah, I always just, because my brain is operating on like 1980s technology, and I always devolve back to like sport metaphors, and like, say there's a quarterback drafted in the 4th round or something, and he ends up being really good. So he's been rejected constantly and was devalued to the near end of the draft, becomes someone good, and then all of a sudden everyone's like, yeah, we had a good grade on that guy. Well, if you had such a good grade on that guy, why didn't you take him earlier? Why didn't you take him at all? So it's one of those things, like, if your story, like, people are going to read this in the Atavist and be like, all those people who were rejected will be like, yeah, it was really good. It just, we wanted to take it, but we didn't. It's just like, well, no, you should have taken it if you thought there was that much value in it. And it's it's going to turn out to be a great story. I mean, because it is a great story.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I absolutely. It's that kind of stuff is frustrating. When you're saying quarterbacks, when was Tom Brady drafted? Was he?
Oh, you're asking the right guy, because I grew up in Massachusetts, and
okay.
Yeah, no, he was a 6th round draft pick, 199 overall.
Because I thought, oh wow,
yeah.
Wow. I thought he was not high in the draft. I mean, and he's like the best quarterback of all time.
Yeah.
Or one of the
Yep.
best. And I'm sure there are other examples aside from Tom Brady, but yeah, it is interesting. And then people look back on it, but that sports analogy makes a lot of sense.
I always devolve to sport metaphors because it just like clicks with me and kind of makes sense. And like, oh yeah, all the scouts out there, you can see scouts as editors and head coaches as editors, and they're not perfect. They take gambles, and they're often wrong, not out of any malicious intent. It just could be a matter of taste at that time, and you just have to keep on delusionally believing in yourself in the face of monumental rejection.
Yeah, in taking that metaphor further, it would be amazing or also demoralizing. But if there were a writer draft every year, like you have the New York Times and New Yorker, and they're like picking all these people, and like you're competing, and like you have to like write, give them your best clips, and you're making it through the rounds and getting money. That would be awesome.
Yeah, a writer combine.
Yeah, yeah. And then you get like the T-shirt. You're like, yeah, I'm going with the New York Times. That's right, guys. Like, and competing for money, it would be amazing. I mean, that's why, like, so I love like people betting on arts. Like I wrote about Oscars betting. Like, I love this idea of combining like the commerce with arts and putting money on stuff and like how that works.
That's awesome. Uh, so with the Handcuff Man and in this story, what were some unique challenges to you as you were you're thinking about the structure and your entry point into the story with with the Michael Jordan, which not that Michael Jordan, different Michael Jordan, and like your entry point to the story and like kind of unique challenges that you experienced throughout the drafting of the story.
Well, that was 100% Sayward, who's one of the best. And I'm not saying this to be nice. Like I tell friends and my boyfriend this, Sayward Darby is one of the best editors like I've ever worked with. Like she's incredible. She will make you sound like a million times better than you are as a writer. And she was the one who suggested Jordan because I initially had Max Trader, who is a guy, a victim in Atlanta who I know and have hung out with, and he's come over to our house for pizza. We become friendly since interviewing him for the story. I initially had him as the lead, and Sayward said no, put Jordan at the beginning because he was kind of like, she didn't say inciting incident, but she implied that like he set everything in motion. And so she rearranged it and restructured it to have him, and I think it worked so much better.
Isn't it crazy? Like, you've been with a piece for, months and months and months. You've read it so many times. And then someone like a Sayward comes along or an equally skilled editor like Jonah Ogles as well, who works with Sayward. And they just almost instantly, they just see things you can't see. It blows me away all the time.
Oh yeah, I mean it's like it's like a gift to me. I'm like, oh my god, she's looking at my stuff. Like I mean I should pay her to edit my book. Like she is. I'm not that I don't even think she does that kind of work, but like she is like a miracle worker in that sense. And so yeah, it's like I've been working with the whole time, and then she changes that. I'm like, oh duh. This like I couldn't see. It's like you're blind when you're stuck in a story. You're blind to the bigger picture. And so that's how she structured that, and that yeah, and then going from this attack, and unfortunately the guy is named Michael Jordan, and like anytime I tell friends about, they're like, what? Michael Jordan's a gay sex worker? I'm like, maybe he was, not sure, he's never addressed it. This is a different Michael Jordan.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it works well because you have that attack that kind of galvanized everything, even though, and that's like the sad and crazy part, you had Handcuff Man, you had this serial predator of gay men who had attacked, police estimated maybe 100 people at this point, had already been arrested for murdering a young gay man, and then got off on the, because no one wanted to testify, they only had circumstantial evidence. So you had this person who police knew the name of the guy, they've been following him for like a decade, and it was really like this public event, and the fact that it was covered by this young man was burned and mutilated on his genitals after Handcuff Man gave him a drink, and said, I'll pay you $50 to drink, and the guy and said like, get hard before you get in my car, and then the guy blacked out and woke up behind the Ponce de Leon hotel, like burns on his genitals. But that whole story, and the fact that it got in Atlanta's biggest paper, that galvanized things. But the gay press had been covering these attacks, or covering attacks on gay men, long before the mainstream press did.
Yeah, and that's talk about the Trojan horse aspect of your story. you talk about that, how the coverage of gay men in this story, they were just patently ignored and not taken seriously. It was almost like we just don't even want to help and support that community. If we just turn away from it, it'll just go away. And that's kind of the tragedy underlying so much of the story.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things, and I talk about it in the story, was they were nearing like the height of the AIDS crisis. Gay men were considered, vectors of disease, and they were dying, and we did not have good treatments for AIDS and HIV, and people were terrified of it. They were scared of gay men. There were all these things, and people, there are preachers saying this was God's punishment for homosexual lifestyles. So you had this whole episode, and so it's like, okay, for some people it's like, okay, gay people are getting murdered. All right, well, they're dying for other reasons, they're spreading disease. I mean, it's disturbing to even talk about it in these terms, but there were people who believed that their lives, they were subhuman, their lives weren't valuable, and then you add sex work into it. And as Max said in this story, even in the gay community, hustlers, gay male sex workers, were lowest of the low. We were the scum on the totem pole, he said. We were the people who, even in that community, if we were getting murdered, well, it's not as bad as, a lawyer, a closeted gay lawyer, or someone else like that.
Yeah, and that also, the main, the Handcuff Man himself, Bennett, at the center of this, he was a lawyer, and closeted gay man, but also protected by his privilege too, given where he, his prominent parents and everything. So no one wanted to touch him, even though they, he was pretty well known to be attached to these attacks.
So yeah, to add to that, he was educated at Emory University Law School. He was white. He was like, as I say in the story, he was like, family was the Kennedys of their small town of Towanda, Pennsylvania. And he was protected by his privilege when he lived in this small town, and he was accused of, molesting boys, paying them for sex. He had some altercation with a gay man and was what ended up not being arrested for it. The man who he had an altercation with ended up being arrested. So he was just protected. His dad was in the pocket of the police there. And that's why he ended up in Atlanta, because the head of police in Towanda was like, send your son to Atlanta, which is terrible. Get him out of here. He's like, attacking everyone here. So he comes down here and does the same stuff. And you would think, well, big city, Atlanta, maybe he wouldn't get the kind of protection he got in the like big fish, small pond, Towanda. But nope. I mean, he was this prominent-ish guy. He was wealthy. He was protected. I mean, he was arrested for kidnapping a police officer. That's crazy. And he just got a $75 fine. It was like, what the hell? Like, kidnapping a police officer who was, to try to, ply him basically with alcohol and set his genitals on fire. He didn't get that far, got arrested beforehand. But this enabled him. If he had been any other race other than white, if he hadn't been rich, I mean, he would not have gotten away with this stuff, in my opinion.
Yeah, and then there's what eventually, leads to him being tried, is this the Williams rule thing. I was wondering, maybe you can expand on that and how that was employed.
Yeah, so it was the Williams rule defense. So basically, he got the Michael Jordan burning happened, and then after that happened, like, the Atlanta police sent out this teletype, because it was the 90s, so it wasn't like email. They sent it around the country and said, hey, we got this weird crime. This man burned. Has anyone else seen anything that happened like that? And in Tampa, they had a crime, almost the exact same MO, where a man had been picked up, Gary Clapp, picked up at Salvation Army by someone claiming, hey, I'll pay you $50 to drink. He picked up Gary Clapp, and Gary drank with him, then blacked out, and the next thing he knew, he was in the mangroves with his legs on fire. He was burned so badly his legs had to be amputated. When Tampa police heard about the Atlanta case, they were like, oh, we can get this guy through the Williams rule through showing a pattern of behavior outside the state of Florida. And so the Williams rule allowed them to show that pattern of behavior and get Robert Lee Bennett Jr. Using similar cases in a different state. And that was really important for this case because, you know, Richard Greer, the AJC reporter I talked to, said he believes that there were attacks throughout the country and in Mexico and in other, you know, other countries. I mean, it's crazy. So you know, with a serial predator like this, having a law like this, having a way to charge someone, that made a difference in getting him the charges he did, getting him convicted.
Yeah, and what's all the more upsetting about the story as well is that it's the root of it comes from Bennett's like internalized homophobia and his hatred of himself and not wanting to be gay and being gay, and then he's exacting that revenge on other gay men, which is just that just adds to yet another tragic grace point to the narrative too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think like that's the like heartbreaking thing is this is a gay man who's growing up. He's born in 47, growing up in a time when being gay was illegal and it was considered a mental illness until 1973 when the APA got rid of that, which was a big fight to end the diagnosis as a mental illness. So you're growing up, you're thinking you're crazy, you're what you're doing is illegal, and all that gets put on him and he internalizes it all and then abuses other people. I mean, you know, there were millions of gay men at this time who did not do what this guy did. Yeah. But thank God. But I think like it is instructive to look at it, like you said, as something where it's like, okay, there are these pressures, there's this negativity, and it turns into self-hatred. That's, you know, there are a lot of gay men and lesbian women and, you know, all queer people, a lot have this kind of feelings because when society's telling you you're sick, you're disturbed, you need to change, you need to convert, it's hard not to feel bad about yourself. And so that is kind of something I think other people can, you know, that make it a bigger tragedy. It's like if and I thought about that as writing the story, if our society was more accepting, would this, I mean, he was obviously a psychopath, but would he been able to channel it in another way? I don't know.
And with the writing of the piece as well, so there's the elements of him, of Bennett, his kind of calling card, if you will, is burning the genitals on his victims. And, you know, at the very end of the story, you know, as he has passed away, you know, in prison, he wants his personal items, you know, burned. And that's how you end the story. And I loved how you end the story there on that element of the irony of that. And it just, at what point did that kind of ring in your head as a good ending?
Well, I'm trying to think if Sayward is the one who suggested that. But yeah, I mean, it's a poetic ending. And I remember, so I can't tell you if I thought to end it that way or she did. But what I will say is when I got my dad suggested I find his will. My dad's a tax and estate attorney. And so he said, and in Florida, which is where Bennett was in jail, he said, fine. And he's like, this is how you get his will. Like, find it, see what it says. So he did. And then I saw that. And I remember literally getting chills and being terrified. I'm like, oh my God, he wants his stuff set on fire. Like he wants all his possessions burned. Like and that's like the way he did other people. And it was almost like he wanted to erase his life and his history, and his way of coping with his desires was burning his own history, like just like he, you know, burned other men on their genitals, which was so like you know, not even a metaphor for like your sexual desires are sick. Like, and so it was poetic in a horrible, disgusting, bizarre way. And I wonder, I actually asked his childhood friend, was he into like fire as a kid? And he wasn't. And she said the worst thing they did as kids was throw pumpkins off a bridge. And yeah, I was like, well, that's not too bad. And she like still felt, she's like the sweetest woman. She's like in her 70s. She still felt bad about like throwing that pumpkin off the bridge. I'm like, that's fine. And it's like interesting that that's his best friend who still feels bad about throwing a pumpkin off a bridge like 50 years later. Meanwhile, like the other best friend, like murdered or not murdered, attacked all these people and like didn't appear to ever feel bad. I'm like, how were these two people best friends? But for me, there was some sort of like, obviously, I kept thinking like the Jekyll Hyde double life thing here, because the way she described him, I'm like, either something happened in high school because she described him as a nice gay man. You know, she's like, we didn't have the words for it then, but I knew he was effeminate and all the girls liked him. And it was her like boyfriend, quote unquote. They only kissed once. And it was like for show. But I'm like, how did something happen in high school? I always, you know, I never figured it out, but it seemed like something had happened. Either that or he was just completely hiding this side of himself.
How did you track down his will?
So I tracked it down through public records request. I think like wills are public information. And I had to go through, I forget what system, if it was the city clerk or something. I had to find out what county he had filed his will in and go to that county and request it. But yeah, I would recommend, you know, if you're doing history, getting people's wills. They can, because I even found sources to talk to from the will. They can be really useful. And, you know, another thing is just like getting more information than you think you're going to use. It's always better to have more, in my opinion.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I got a divorce deposition stuff from the 1940s for, you know, the book I'm working on, and it has such incredible detail in it, and it's just like, oh wow, like it was one of those things I didn't really know to look for. I worked with I hired a researcher to help me do some things, and she's just really good at finding things. And then she came across just something that was like a divorce filing, but not all the deposition stuff. And I was like, oh, where would I even find this stuff? She's like, oh, you can ask the county courthouse. And so I just emailed the county courthouse, and I'm like, do you have record of this? And a few hours later, she emailed me like a 30-page PDF of the entire thing. I was like, holy fuck, this is pretty amazing stuff. Sad, but amazing.
I'm so jealous that you got that, because I tried to get his Handcuff Man's divorce deposition, which the previous journalist had gotten. It was from the 80s and in stupid Fulton County. I mean, Fulton County's fine where I live. But anyway, or it was DeKalb County. But anyway, they had destroyed it. They're like, we destroy things that are this many years old. I'm like, why? So annoying. So some counties like keep them. And I'm so glad you got that material, because I've been trying to get divorce proceedings for other things that are, you know, older and haven't been able to get them. But this is another reason why, like, I've never been married. But like, if you get married and then get divorced, you know, all your shit goes out there. Like, so watch out, you know, like it's such a gret source for historians. So you better keep your stuff buttoned up. That's what I always think.
Yeah, keep it tight, everyone.
Yeah.
Well, very nice. Well, I want to be mindful of your time, Hallie. And yeah, as you bring these conversations down for a landing, I always love asking the guests for a recommendation of some kind for the listeners out there, and that can just be anything you're excited about. So that's, you know, bringing some degree of joy to your life, and so I just extend that to you, Hallie.
Okay, so what I'm most excited about in this is a new season of Curb Your Enthusiasm. I'm a huge Larry David fan. It's the last season. So that's what I'm really into right now. And so these are not like novel recommendations or whatever. Although I read the novel Thrust, which was really good. Just finished that. But the other thing is the movie Love Lies Bleeding, the A24 movie starring Kristen Stewart. That's a lesbian wrestling noir. highly recommend it.
Oh, fantastic. So, yeah, this is wonderful. So, yeah, thank you so much for the time and coming on the show and talking shop about this amazing story that you've written. So, yeah, thanks, Hallie. Thanks for the time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. This was so fun.
Good time, right? Thanks to Sayward and Hallie. Visit magazine.atavist.com to subscribe to the magazine and read The Handcuff Man. We're 2.5 weeks from my major deadline, my official deadline, the one that if I violate it, I have to give all my money back. Give them my money back. I've cut 20,000 words from the book. Got about 30,000 to go. It's brutal. And I'm at the point in the manuscript where I can no longer tell if it's boring or if I'm merely bored with it, because I can practically recite it by memory. Like, do musicians who play a song 1,000 times, like, can they look at the song and they're like, oh, this song's just bad or boring, or are they just bored with it? I guess they can tell by looking at the audience. But with this book, I'm going block by block, scene by scene, and asking, what are you adding to the story? What is your job? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? There's a 250-word paragraph. It's merely atmospheric. It doesn't do any lifting, let alone heavy lifting. You're cool and all, kind of cute, but you gotta go. This person I interviewed for 90 minutes or more, okay, you might get a single sentence in the book. This person I platformed for 1,000 words, I'm sorry, you get like 100 now, if that. I've done the low-hanging fruit edits. I'm in the mid-hanging fruit edits. The one where you start to need like that little basket thing where you like put the extender on it and you reach way up and you get like an apple and your thing catches it and you get the apple there. Yeah. Then this is the kind of the bigger swaths and chunks. And then the final pass with eyes glazed and burning. Can you cut a single word from every sentence on average? Remove all unnecessary passive voice. Yeah, maybe that'll account for 10,000 more words. My eyes are bloodshot. My chest is always tight. And I think I hurt my back again. My overhead press is plateaued. And I keep eating fucking peanut butter like it's water. And there's this bald spot in my beard. And it makes me wonder if I should just shave it all off. So that's writing a book. And you wake up at night. And you're like, fuck. I can't believe I didn't use that newspaper archive at all. And then you go to the couch and you can't sleep. And you're staring at the blue light of the Simply Safe base station, and you're like, fuck. And you're also like, if you can't do, interview, see ya.